Welcome to part 2 of our Parent and Employee Handbook video. In this video, we will continue to build the required policies and procedures for ODJFS licensing. As a reminder, a written copy of these policies and procedures must be implemented in your program and be made available to all families and staff. This section of your handbook will include information about how your program manages illness, which includes isolation precautions, symptoms for discharge and returning back to your program, notification to families of a sick child, and for family child care, whether or not the program will care for children with illness. Some questions to help guide you in completing this section are: what symptoms indicate that a child needs to be sent home or stay home? What happens if a child gets sick while at the program? How will families be notified of a sick child or if a child's condition worsens? When can a child return after illness? Is a doctor's note required? How and when will families be notified if their child has been exposed to a communicable disease? And finally, do you have a lice or nit policy? Another component of managing illness are your procedures in the event of an emergency illness or injury. You may want to consider these questions when developing this section. How will families be notified in the event of an emergency? What is the backup plan for care if there is an emergency? What is the procedure to complete an incident report? What are the emergency preparedness plans? How are these plans shared with families? How frequently are fire and tornado drills completed? What are the emergency plans for evacuation, and what site will be used in the event of an emergency evacuation? What are the emergency plans for lockdown? And what are the emergency plans for shelter in place? To submit your license application, you will also submit a disaster plan that outlines all of these emergency procedures, along with some additional details. Be sure they are aligned together to make a strong and efficient set of policies and procedures on emergency situations. In the next part of your handbook, you will identify policies and procedures for administering medication and topical products. You will want to be sure to include policies and procedures for both prescription and over-the-counter medication, medical foods and food supplements, modified diets, and whether school-age children are permitted to carry their own medication and ointments. Some additional questions to consider are: does your program administer medication? If so, what type of medications will you administer? If your program administers medications, what are your policies for administering these different medication types? Where will medication be stored? What is the procedure for no longer needed or expired medication? How will medication administration be recorded? How will any food allergies be handled? Will your program administer any food supplements? And finally, how will your program handle modified food diets for children? Keep in mind that some of these policies will need a specific document or JFS form filled out by a family member and/or a doctor. Refer to the rule for this information. The next policy in your handbook is on the transportation of children. This is where you will share how your program will handle field trips, routine walks, and emergencies, including if the program will provide childcare services to children whose family refuses consent for transportation to a source of emergency treatment. Some additional things to think about are: will children be transported on routine trips, for example, to and from school? Will children be transported on field trips? What type of vehicle will be used for transportation? Who will provide the required car seats or boosters? What is the supervision plan for trips? How will permission be obtained from families for transportation? How will children be accounted for during routine trips and field trips? And lastly, what child information will you bring with you to be prepared in case of an emergency? Keep in mind that some of these policies may have a document or JFS form that will need to be completed. In the next section, you will describe your program policy and procedures for providing water activities. In writing your program procedures, you may want to consider the following questions. Will the program offer water activities? And if so, where will the water activities be located? How will permission be obtained? What is the supervision plan for water activities? Is there a plan for non-swimmers? Again, there are JFS forms for water play. Please consult the rule for additional information. If your program cares for infants, you will need to include your program's policies and procedures for feeding, diapering, and information about daily activities. Some things to think about when caring for infants are: what is the feeding schedule for infants? How will you help infants transition from breast milk or formula to solid foods? How frequently will you perform diaper checks? Where will diapers be changed? How will you individualize infant care plans and schedules? And finally, what are your crib and cot requirements? In the next section, you will describe your program's policies and procedures for providing sleeping, napping, and resting arrangements. It is a good idea to break out this section based on age groups, such as infant, toddler, preschool, and school age. Some things to consider are: when and where will children rest or nap? How are safe sleeping practices implemented? Is there written permission from families for alternative sleep arrangements? What happens when a child does not fall asleep? Do families need to bring blankets for children over 12 months of age? If yes, who washes them and where are they stored? If your program offers evening or overnight care, you will need to describe your program's policies and procedures for caring for children during these non-traditional hours. For instance, you may want to think about what the schedule for overnight care is. How will bath time, toothbrushing, and dressing for bed be handled? Lastly, where do the children sleep overnight? In the next section, you will describe your program's policy and procedures for changes to typical operating hours, such as closure due to weather or school delays. While often we think about winter as when programs need to close or have delayed openings, you may also want to consider other events such as power outage or loss of heat. Other things to consider are: how will closings or delays be managed and communicated to families? What other events might require your program to close? All programs can use substitute teachers for sick days, vacation time, and other time off. However, family childcare providers must have a section in their handbook that references the family childcare rules on substitute teachers. Center-based programs do not need this requirement in their handbook. Please see the family childcare rules for more information. There can be many reasons for disenrolling a child, from the family moving or choosing another program that better meets their needs, to situations with children and families that present no alternative other than disenrollment. By having a strong policy and set of procedures, you should be able to handle these circumstances with confidence. Some things to keep in mind are: what type of notification do you need from families if they wish to disenroll their child? Under what circumstances will you disenroll a child, including behavior issues that endanger other children and themselves, failure to pay tuition and/or fees, and failure to comply with program policies? Remember, there are organizations that can work with you and families to help keep children in care. One example in Ohio is the Ohio Preschool Expulsion Prevention Partnership, and you can find more about this program on their website. Conflict of any sort can be challenging, whether it's between families, staff, or administrators. Establishing clear guidelines for how your program resolves conflict can help you remain consistent in your process and help everyone understand why decisions were made. Some questions to consider are: how will your program seek to resolve problems with families? What will happen if an agreement cannot be reached or if the situation becomes volatile? If you have employees, how should conflict between administration and employees be resolved? And how will you help resolve problems between employees? If your program participates in Step Up to Quality and is highly rated with a 3, 4, or 5 star, you will need to include a section in your handbook about how your program conducts formal child screening and assessments. If you need this section, be sure to include the name of the screener and assessment tools used, how you or the teachers will be trained to use the tools, how often you conduct child screenings and assessments, and how you use the data that is collected. If your program does not participate in Step Up to Quality or is not highly rated, then you do not need to include this section in your handbook. In this next section, I will discuss some of the additional policies and procedures you should consider including in your handbook. While these are not required by ODJFS, it is always a good idea to include them to lay a solid foundation of expectations for staff. Most businesses have some sort of dress code for their employees, and you should too. Keep in mind the type of work that your staff will be doing daily when making decisions about what clothing is allowed in your program. Some programs provide shirts, aprons, or other items to their employees, while others do not. The decision is up to you. Either way, be sure to provide clear guidance about your expectations for workplace appearance. We all know that sometimes people cannot come to work, whether it's because they don't feel well, an emergency has come up, or for some other reason. Be sure to create a policy on how staff should call off of work. Think about what time they should call in by and who they should call. You should also create a policy for how and when staff are given opportunities for break. We know that working with young children can be exhausting work, and everyone needs a break, or several throughout the day. Consider how your program will provide these times and what procedures you will have in place to make sure everyone gets an equal opportunity for breaks. Another policy and procedure you should include in your employee handbook is one or several on personal time off, or PTO. PTO refers to any time that staff would like to take off, such as vacations, for doctor's appointments, sick time, or other instances that may arise. Some programs establish specific amounts of time for each type of time off, while others create one larger bucket of time that employees can draw from for their specific needs. The choice is yours. Just be sure to establish clear guidelines for how time is given and tracked. All program staff are required to create a profile in the Ohio Professional Registry, or OPR. This system will help them sign up for and track completed training. Each staff person is also required to complete a specific number of training hours each year. To help make this process easy to maintain, you should create a policy that explains the requirements and include the time frame for completing training hours. And finally, An important policy and procedure to include in your handbook is for conducting staff performance reviews. This is an opportunity to acknowledge staff strengths and areas of improvement that should be developed over the next year. Some things to think about are: how do you document staff skills and abilities throughout the year? When do you conduct staff performance reviews? And how do you determine areas of improvement and promotion? Don't forget to read through the JFS licensing rules, as additional information may be required that we have not specifically covered here. Also, be sure to check out the Early Learning Resources Ohio website. This website has many resources and some specific to handbooks that you may find helpful, and it's all available for free to Ohio child care providers. This concludes Part 2 of our Parent and Employee Handbook video. If you have watched both videos, you should now have a great start in operating your child care program. If you missed Part 1, you can find that along with other great resources on our website. Thanks for watching.